Welcome to the Rehumanization Station. I'm your collaborator, Christopher Jones, aka Dr. X, and this podcast is an extension to my Flippin' and Vibin' brand, where vibers seek to transform narratives in society, education, sport, and a variety of other sectors. We are now, again, in our season 2 for our collaborative practice series, where we have a laid-back viber named James Rowlands with us today. James, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
I'm glad. Thank you for being here. Okay, so a bit of James' background. So James is an assistant professor in sociology at Durham University. And before joining Durham, James was a lecturer in criminology at the University of Westminster. James completed his ESRC-funded doctoral research at the University of Sussex in 2023. His thesis investigated Domestic Homicide Reviews, which is a system for reviewing domestic homicides and domestic abuse-related deaths by suicide, which were first introduced in England and Wales in 2011 and are now known as domestic abuse-related death reviews. So this should be a very interesting episode. Like I said, when I was reading up the work that you sent me, it was I was very intrigued because it was something that is completely new to me, and our audience, my vibers listening, hopefully you'll enjoy this conversation that we're going to have. Now, also, before completing a PhD, James originally trained as a social worker and then became an independent domestic violence advisor, working in frontline roles with victims and survivors and also perpetrators of domestic abuse. I love to hear you've been on both sides, right? That's really good. That's right. Really good. James also worked in a variety of leadership and policy roles in the domestic abuse sector. Now, James' research interests are domestic violence and abuse, domestic homicide, and domestic abuse-related deaths by suicide, fatality review systems, femicide, LGBTQ plus victims or survivors, male victim or survivors, and ironically, Deutschsprechen. So so it's interesting. James and I, we were in the same German course, and that's where we met. So that's why I tell people you got to be open and curious. So James is, nice, I'll say lively, and we started talking, and we ended up realizing that we worked we did our research in the same department.
Yeah, indeed. And perhaps weren't always good with our homework.
We're here today. We won't be speaking Dutch for y'all, but I'm excited about today's episode. It's going to be very enlightening, and also, I guess all the episodes are emotional, but they have different types of impact for different types of people that listen to it, right? So please be aware that this is also another sensitive topic that we're going to get into, and it's important that however you're feeling when you're listening to this, that we're coming from a place of love and a place of understanding, right? And that's the main thing we're trying to do here. All right. So now we're going to we're at the part of our vibing questions. So this is the part of the show where we just vibe and allow our listeners to get an idea of your background and your personal interests, okay? So, James, you want to tell us a bit about yourself? So what's your story, birthplace, family?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Wales, born in South Wales on the coast, so a seaside town. So have you ever been to like Whitley Bay or Tynemouth up this end of the world? It's a bit like that. Okay. So small seaside town. About 20,000 people. So grew and I think we moved there when I was about 5 or 6. Okay. Moved down from a bit further inland in Wales. And I was there till I was 18. So it's a nice, very nice childhood in many ways, right? Growing up by the sea.
That's cool.
Bit of free range childhood to some extent.
Is it as cold there as it is here?
No, it's warmer, but it's wetter there. Wales is wet.
Okay.
Yeah. You just got rained on all the time.
Dang, okay. So what would you prefer? What did you prefer?
What, weather-wise?
Or living-wise?
Oh, it's a hard one. I mean, so this is my first winter up here. So I moved up here last year, and I did not have enough jumpers. So it's a key investment. I needed more jumpers. So what would you rather be, wet or cold? It's a hard choice. But Wales is beautiful, beautiful landscape in many places. Really rich industrial history. So there's kind of it shares a kind of connected heritage really with the Northeast as well in terms of that history and then the consequences of deindustrialization and changes up through the 80s, 90s and so on. But so growing up, nice town. So I got a brother, sister. So it's a good place to be.
Okay, brother, sister. So, are you the oldest, youngest, middle?
I'm kind of in the middle. Yeah, my sister's 10 years older, and my brother's a year younger. So I'm in the middle, but I think I behave a bit like an older brother, at least as far as my brother's concerned.
It's interesting because I was talking about this in the episode before, but like we've had quite a few middle children on here because I'm technically middle as well, but I have a twin, identical twin, but I was born first, so I was the third out of 5.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like. But yeah, it's interesting how we've had quite a few. Maybe there's research on middle children doing activist research.
See, another research silo to go straight down.
Okay, so are your family still in Wales?
Well, my mum is, and my sister is, and she's got 3 kids. The last of whom is going off to university shortly.
Okay.
And then my brother's in Bristol, but my mum's side of the family comes from England originally, so hence why my accent is perhaps not particularly Welsh. So I'm what you could call stealth Welsh. So.
Okay, I've never been. I don't really know what a Welsh accent sounds like.
Oh, I'll leave. I'm not going to try and put one on.
You don't have to do it.
This is not the Traitors.
You don't have to do it. It's not the
someone putting on their Welsh accent. I'm not going to risk that.
Okay, but you don't have one technically.
It comes back a bit in Wales when I'm at home long enough, and the occasional word or intonation sometimes. But yeah, I left at 18. So I left, I think, Wales because it felt quite small. When I was 18,
gotcha.
So I also grew up. I was gay. I'm a gay guy, so grew up. It didn't feel like a particularly, open space in the that would have been in the mid 90s, I guess. So anyway, kind of left at 18. Was like, I'm out of here. So crossed the border, but still go back now. It's obviously things change, right?
Okay, so you think things has changed for the better?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of LGBT life, right? Yeah, I mean, obviously we've got some real challenges as well, but just in terms of representation, acceptance, it's a vastly different arena to growing up 20 or 30 years ago. Okay,
that's good. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And what about activities? So what type of activities bring you, peace, love, and happiness?
Yeah, good one. Seems I'm quite into my sport at the moment, so I play tennis, swim, and boulder mainly. You
play tennis?
Yeah. Not
where do you
well.
play?
I play with an LGBT tennis club.
Really?
Yeah, up in Newcastle.
Because I'm going on a sports holiday with my partner, and her dad is really good at tennis. And I'm
need some emergency top-up.
I need some people to play with. Like, I'm okay, but tennis. Okay, and how is in Newcastle? You said, or
yeah.
Okay.
So it's a tennis club. But kind of LGBT tennis club. So it plays up in Newcastle. It's great, really nice. I mean, my tennis is pretty average, I would say, but a nice chance to kind of get out and play. I would love
to join one day, at least before I leave. I leave in like 2 weeks.
Okay, you need some intensive additional tennis prep.
Something like that. Okay, so tennis. Anything else?
Tennis, tennis, swim, bouldering. So quite active at the moment. I read pretty much, like cinema, theatre, that kind of stuff. And one of the benefits of moving somewhere for the first time is you get to spend all that time exploring, right? So I lived in Brighton for 11 years before moving here, and Brighton in the southeast Sussex, it's a beautiful part of the world, but after a while you're not always going to see new things, right? Because you've been there for so long. So what's been nice the last 6 months or so is I've been doing a lot of exploring. So getting my head around Durham, Newcastle, Gateshead, wider Northumberland. Okay. So it's pretty good.
I heard you say bouldering. That's something new to me. Is it like rock climbing or
kind of? So it's not, but you're not on a rope, right? So and you're indoors. So I've only recently started, but you're climbing up walls, and it's kind of set different levels. So it's climbing, but you're not doing it on a rope. So you ultimately aren't going to fall off a vast amount, but they can get pretty high.
Man, okay, I've never done that before.
It's good fun.
Cool. Okay,
add that to your list.
I'll definitely do that. We'll definitely do that. Okay, so you said, what about music? Any type of music you like?
I like some music. So
any genres?
I'm probably kind of an indie kid at heart.
Okay.
So you definitely tell I grew up in the 90s in South Wales, and particularly Welsh, like Manic Street Preachers. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're my favourite band.
Manic Street Preachers. Okay, I'll have to listen to that then.
So but I'm otherwise pretty eclectic when it comes to music.
Okay, got you. Okay, and what about research interests? So like,
So my research is mainly domestic abuse related, pretty much all domestic abuse related. So primarily domestic homicide, or as they're being renamed, as you said, domestic abuse related death reviews. Globally, they're sometimes called fatality review. Some varying forms of that language, but they all do the same thing. So how we learn from these tragedies. So I'm interested in that.
Do you know why? Sorry to interrupt you, but do you know why they're changing the names for it?
So in England and Wales, I mean, it's like anything, right? So these are similar systems, and they're kind of connected. They know about each other, so you can kind of trace how they've evolved and developed in one country, and that's influenced another. And often the name is, kind of naming convention's the wrong word, but it's kind of named in the way you'd expect something to be named in the States or Australia or whatever. In the UK specifically, they started off as domestic homicide reviews when they were introduced. They were called murder reviews, I think, at one point when they were being kind of talked about, but they got introduced as domestic homicide reviews, and that's when they were looking at domestic homicides only, right? So they were looking at intimate partner relationships, so former or current partners, where one is killed by another. But they were also looking at adult family cases, so where perhaps a mother or a father is killed by their adult son. But in 2016, the guidance was amended to allow these reviews to look at domestic abuse-related deaths by suicide, so where someone's died by suicide, but there's this history of domestic abuse. And obviously the name doesn't really work then, right? You can't call the process domestic homicide review. It's taken a long time to change it, but it has finally been changed. So the name should be calming domestic abuse-related death review. The problem we got right now is it's been changed in legislation, but that legislation has not been enacted. So we're kind of we're waiting, but a lot of people are referring them now as domestic abuse-related death reviews. People just get on with things. They don't always wait for the policy to catch up.
Wow, okay, I got you. Okay, we'll talk a bit more further down the show about how that interests you and stuff. Why you chose that research? If that's okay. Okay, what about people who have been influential in the work that you do at different stages of your life?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of this work specifically, I've been really lucky that. So I trained as a social worker, and when I wanted to train as a social worker, actually, I was really interested in disability. That's what I was interested in working on. And then I went back to Cardiff. So I talked about going back to Wales. Right. So I went back to Cardiff and was there for a few years. And it was really good. But got there thinking I was going to do disability stuff, disability rights. And actually, my first year ended up getting interested in domestic abuse. And kind of transitioned. Actually, originally, it was an academic exercise. I was writing an essay. So my second essay in social work was on domestic abuse. So it's probably my first term, I can't remember. And then every essay I wrote after that was on domestic abuse. So I kind of really got it, and then kind of went from a kind of academic interest to a practice interest and an activist one. But that's a slightly long way of saying that in that journey, there's obviously been people who've been really influential. So someone called Jan Pickles, for example, who ran something called the Cardiff Women's Safety Unit. And when I was training as a social worker, she actually gave me a student placement to set up a men's project called the Dean Project, working with heterosexual and gay by male victims of domestic abuse. So it was one of the first projects of its kind. And so she was a absolute inspiration and really brilliant role model. And so there's been people like that throughout my life. I've been really lucky to meet and kind of work with and alongside, and have been a real kind of inspiration really in terms of the work, both in terms of why domestic abuse is important, but also actually what that means for us when we do that work. Because obviously, like you started off, as you said, it's emotional, right? It's a sensitive topic, so you have to think about yourself in that space as well.
So what made you, treading back to what you mentioned, what made you want to do disabilities first?
So it's based on my experience as an undergrad. So when I was an undergrad, I'd become a college welfare officer.
Okay.
And then I became a sabbatical officer, actually, for the student union. And in that, a lot of what I found myself doing was kind of casework related in one way or another to kind of disability, often about access and, in that terrible jargon, kind of reasonable adjustments for things like exams.
Right.
And a lot of that time, it just felt like you were fighting a fight, right? And, students were facing real challenges, which were often, it's not just about dealing with the difficult situation, perhaps, in terms of, well, what's the technical solution? It's like institutions weren't very good at actually doing that. I think the best example of that is, for years I remember there'd be arguments about whether students could record lectures or get slides, all that kind of stuff. And, that was always a massive fight. And of course, COVID comes along, and it turns out, of course, we can. It's really easy to change those things because suddenly it affects everyone. But anyway, so this was in the early 2000s. But so got caught into a lot of that stuff. So that's what I went with a real interest, in, which I kind of still have, but I kind of got diverted into domestic abuse, which was a real surprise. If you'd asked 18-year-old James, what are you going to do? I don't think he'd have expected me to be a social worker, for one. So I did a history degree originally, and he certainly wouldn't expect me to have gone off and got into domestic abuse as a kind of area of work and then research.
Okay, man. So just wanting to support people, it's kind of what shifted. And what made you shift to domestic abuse?
It was that, like I said, it was that just kind of interest, right? It was that specific academic interest. In fact, the essay I had to. In fact, I think your last speaker, last person, Ray, who you interviewed, he gave that example of what is good enough as parenting. I think he talked about, if I remember rightly, and that was actually the essay. So the essay was something along the lines of like, what is good enough parenting? And I answered that to think about, well, what's good enough parenting in the context of someone who's experienced domestic abuse? Like, how do we understand that? And obviously, a lot of the research and practice and people's experience would be that often these systems end up blaming the victim, the person who's experienced that abuse, and the perpetrator kind of drops from view, and they're you get this weight of the system falling on that person who judges them not to be good enough for any number of reasons, rather than asking, well, hang on, what's going on here, and what's the context of within which that parenting is happening. And so that was that first essay, and that just kind of snowballed into that first placement, working with men, and then practice.
Wow. Okay. Wow. That's cool. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And also, so what about when it comes to challenging moments, right? So the research that you do, the work that you do, obviously it's like I said, I've never been in that realm because I never read up on that type of work until recently, obviously, since you showed me some of the stuff. But what do you think are some challenging moments for you as an academic, and how have you navigated them?
Yeah, I think it's kind of links back to what you were talking about at the start in terms of this being sensitive, right? Like, this is, I'm researching specifically domestic abuse related deaths, homicides, really awful situations, which are often preceded by really awful abuse, or people's experience of systems which aren't necessarily helping them. And these are really difficult stories. And if you want to attend to them well and like honour the person at the centre of them, you have to really listen, right? You have to really engage with what you're reading. If you're practicing as someone who's leading one of these reviews, you might be meeting families of someone who's been killed or who's died by suicide, and so you're coming to know someone to some extent, right? And that's a real privilege. You're seeing a snapshot of perhaps their life, but it comes with a really heavy burden, and that kind of emotional labour of going into that space and reading these stories and trying to think about how you work with that information in a respectful way, right? You're not just there to pull out some interesting data and kind of wander off. You're thinking about how you hold that person central, and that's a lot of what my focus in my research is. Like, how do we make sure these processes aren't exploitative, that they keep the victim at the center, that they tell a victim story in a way that they'd recognize, right? And that it is meaningful to their family, for example. So that's really hard. And I guess those are the kind of situations where it can be really challenging. So it can be really challenging to center yourself in that space and stay in that space, right? And we've all been there where we're in some way doing something, you just get caught up in process, right? Whatever that might be. And this process happens to be research. And you might then lose focus on that victim story. So that's one part of that. But then equally, sometimes you just need to step away because it's draining. It's emotionally really taxing. So and sometimes you're reading stuff that's just heartbreaking. So again, you then need to work out, well, how do I manage that? Because ultimately, what you don't want to do is burn out. You don't want to just be reading this stuff and it not affecting you, because that's even worse, right? Because this stuff should be effective. These are people's lives and deaths. We need to hold that kind of close.
Okay. And I was going to ask around, because it's more about your background and everything you just mentioned about honoring. I love how you said all of that, how you articulated that. You mentioned earlier about your 18-year-old self never thought you would be doing this type of work, right?
Yeah.
But how would you have considered yourself as a person, a young person growing up, like in your teenage years? Did you consider yourself a compassionate person, or does that make sense? Were you already kind of practicing that type of behavior when you were younger?
That's a good question. I don't. God, I haven't thought about that. I'd like to think so. I mean, I think growing up, I had, I was quite academic, probably quite geeky. Probably could be read as likely a gay guy, or at least kind of not meeting a kind of really traditional script of kind of masculinity, right? So I think oftentimes I was holding stuff quite close, but I had a kind of a good group of close friends, a lot of whom turned out to be queer subsequently. So clearly we found each other, even though we didn't know. So I mean, within those spaces and within those relationships and networks, absolutely. I think a lot of that was about those relationships you build with people and the kind of care and attention you have to their lives. I don't think I would have thought about applying it more broadly, right? Like out to other people. I don't think I'd had that idea that I'd go off and be a social worker, for example, and be going into effectively strangers' lives to build those relationships. Yeah,
because we're talking about this before about like understanding our own story, you know. I feel like I can relate to that a bit because I know like the work I do around like racial and social justice, I was very shy growing up, but I always had this inner feeling where I didn't like bullies. I never liked seeing people hurt or being discriminated. You know what I'm saying? I always had that feeling, even if I didn't have the language for it or didn't know how to approach it, I still had that feeling where this is not okay, this is not right. And I guess the older I got, the more experiences I've had in terms of like having a voice, developing a resiliency, developing a bit more, I would say. I mean, there's courage both ways, but just experiences in ways that kind of empowered me to kind of speak out, and you know what I'm saying, from knowledge production and just that lived experience kind of brought out that inner activist in me, you know what I mean, that inner activist that I never thought I would ever have growing up. So that's why I wanted to ask that question, because it's interesting.
It's a good question. And it makes sense, right? We kind of build on ourselves, right? Like we're drawing that stuff.
Well, we hope to. Yeah, most of us.
Sometimes we work out the building's a bit ropey, and we might have to do a bit of patching up. But,
all right. Well, thank you for sharing your story. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Now we're gonna get more into. Let's flip it. Okay, we're gonna get to more of the flipping questions. We're gonna get more into like deep down and into the research that you do. So, like I said, now we'll get more into your work and how you flip the script to traditional narratives within it. I've had a chance to do an overview of some of your work as a researcher. Much of your work is around, like we talked about before, domestic abuse-related reviews and prevention. So for our Viber audience and us too, let's attempt to flip the domestic abuse review script, shall we? Now, I know we were going to talk a little bit about femicide today, and I'm going to give a brief definition. I know you can kind of highlight more about it, but so femicide for the audience is intentional killing with a gender-related motivation, or gender-related motivations, right? And I don't know, how do you feel about that? I know it could be a broad definition, and if you want to kind of give us some insight around that.
Yeah. So, maybe there's a bit of context to that as well. So if you think about what I'm interested in, right? So intimate partner violence leading to fatality, so where someone's killed someone, or domestic abuse-related deaths by suicide, they're really gendered, right? So men and women can experience domestic abuse and can experience, can be killed or die as a result of domestic abuse. But when you look at who's being killed and how, it's incredibly gendered. So the vast majority of victims are women, normally killed by men. So, if you think about domestic homicide as a language, I think some of the people who kind of developed early ideas around femicide, what they were trying to draw attention to is the gendered nature of those killings, right? That it just kind of hid it amongst this general homicide data, and actually these are gender related. So that's where femicide comes from, and there's debates about how you define that. So is it any killing of women and girls, right? Or is it an intentional killing of women and girls? In which case, how do you determine intent? Some language you might see more currently is things like sex and gender related motives and indicators, where we're trying to say, well, look, if these kind of things are happening, or there's this history of this kind of type, well, that might tell us that that's a kind of femicide case. Okay. But yeah, regardless, what you're talking about are these kind of a perpetrator's actions, right? That's directly killed someone or led someone to die by suicide. So it's a really tricky area, and oftentimes the script we're trying to flip actually is the perpetrators, right? So if you think about what happens after a murder, the victim's story can get really lost really quickly, because it becomes about the conviction or the attempt to convict a perpetrator. It goes into the criminal justice system. Okay. And it's the Crown in the UK versus the perpetrator, right? And so the story all becomes the perpetrators, their defense. And in their defense, of course, they may say any number of things about the victim. So all of that means we kind of move, or risk moving, steadily away from a victim's story. And someone called Jane Monckton Smith called that the forensic narrative. So it's like the perpetrator's story. And that maybe is one of the first scripts that we can try and flip. And I think a lot of people who introduce Domestic Homicide Review and work on them, or domestic abuse related death reviews, are trying to flip. They're trying to say, hang on, let's return to the person who matters here in terms of their story. Let's go center the victim here. And of course we need to think about what happened with the perpetrator and their journey too, but the person who needs to be at the center is the victim. And then when we do that, we also have to do that in a way that's not victim blaming, and doesn't and you could contend this flipping ever further, but doesn't repeat really unhelpful stereotypes or tropes about why someone might have been killed or whatever that may be. And that's pretty hard work, actually. That's challenging for everyone to do that well.
Wow. So you answered kind of my question. So I was going to ask about what are your perceptions. So what are your perceptions of like the normative narratives in the work that you do then?
So, for example, oftentimes, and there's lots of great work on this, oftentimes if we think about perpetrators, we've often got this narrative of love, right, in intimate relationships. And that's in Hollywood, that's in books, like everyone's seeking out this idealized partner and these halcyon days. And then even when we're dealing with separation or end of relationships, that's often still really wrapped up in stories of love, right? So there'll be accounts of somebody kind of pursuing someone and not letting go. And I would often read that as like at least problematic, possibly stalking, but often that's represented as quite romantic, right? This someone standing outside a window with a red rose. So you often that means the perpetrator's often given quite a light ride, right? If you think about sometimes how their stories are represented, so jilted lover does X, which in a way kind of makes it explicable, right? And if it's explicable, it's kind of almost defensible. or understandable. Whereas actually what we're kind of saying, well, hang on, no, like this is domestic abuse. In this case, domestic abuse related killing. So that script of kind of flipping it away from some kind of justification or understandingness of these forms of violence and abuse to actually saying, hang on, let's stay with the victim. But then when we then try and make sense of a victim's experiences, there's so many problematic scripts within that. So victim blaming, like I already talked about. And sometimes, you know, that's about how we try and make sense of that. So what a domestic homicide or domestic abuse related death review does, and it's perhaps helpful to say, is it kind of gathers everyone around the table, all the agencies and professionals involved in that case, to try and understand what their contact was, what happened, whether they intervened or not, and why not, and then learn from that, right? So it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. And you're trying to say, for example, did the victim call the police? When the victim called the police, what happened? Did they then support a prosecution, right? You're kind of working that through. And a really simplistic analysis would be, yes, the victim did call the police, but they weren't supportive of a prosecution, so wouldn't give a statement. But the police followed all their procedure. Job done, right? And there'd be nothing to learn there, because really you'd followed procedure, you'd offered support. Whereas really what you want to do with a review is flip that and say, okay, sure, that's what happened. Why did that individual feel they couldn't give a statement? What might we want to think about their previous contact with the police, or the context within which that offer was made, or the opportunity to put that information together over several incidents and think, well, maybe we need to do something different. So oftentimes it's about thinking about alternatives.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what would, I guess you just mentioned it, but what would like a domestic abuse related death review, what does that look like?
So the ultimate product is a report, right? And in the UK or England and Wales, we normally publish those reports. They're anonymised, but they're an account of what happened, what was known, what was going on in that relationship, what the history was, what kind of contact they had with services, what interventions there were, or what missed opportunities there were, for example. And then the idea is you do that by bringing everyone together. Like I said, it's a dialogue between agencies, family and friends may be involved in different ways as well. And you're ultimately trying to produce this account of, well, this is what happened. And then from that to learn. So you might be asking, what was the practice of professionals? What was the policy framework? What was the kind of systemic context to make sense of this? And what might we do differently? That's the idea, right? And sometimes also, what can we point to as good practice, even though we didn't necessarily avoid a death? So sometimes agencies have done really, really great work, but for some reason it's not prevented that death, and we need to understand what worked, even if we couldn't necessarily avoid the worst case kind of outcome. So you're trying to tell that story and use that to analyze how well we respond to domestic abuse, basically. And the idea is you can use that to improve practice, policy and systems in the future. You can prevent maybe a domestic abuse related death. Perhaps more realistically, you can try and improve provision for all victims, with the hope that would mean we can prevent future deaths, right? That's the idea. But ultimately, it's a report with some recommendations, which are saying, you know, A, B, and C need to do X, Y, Z. Right.
And it's like you mentioned about the victims, and how, I know you mentioned the paper around, I think you and colleagues have said, like, invisible victims are, there's two subcategories. It was like two things. It was like invisible victims are not counted and undervalued. I think those are the two specific words you use. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So I think sometimes what happens, so there's an interesting question there, right? So visibility happens in two ways broadly. So there's the victims who perhaps are never subject to a review for some reason. And that might be because their death is not identified as domestic abuse related, or in some way perhaps they don't quite fit what we think of. So a really good example of that might be some cases in maybe same-sex relationships, right, where perhaps people weren't out, so people didn't know about the relationship, and agencies aren't very good at capturing that potentially. So then there might be a death or a killing, but we don't realise that it's domestic abuse related. So people may never get into the system in the first place. And there's wider work actually in the context of kind of femicide is often looking at also these things called hidden homicides, where perhaps homicides are hidden and, by a perpetrator, which is another, or framed in a certain way. So some people don't get into the system at all, right? That's an invisibility, and sometimes that's because we don't see those relationships. The other kind of invisibility, I guess, is once you're in that system, depending, as that review's happening, as people are sitting around the table kind of talking about what contact they had, what learning there may be, the extent, what can happen is we end up focusing on individuals, right? And whether they made, definitely in inverted commas, the right choice. Did they take up support or not, right? What I was talking about before. But what we often do as well when we individualize is forget the structural stuff. And or we just kind of use a really easy to go to version of that to make things explicable. So there's some really great research by someone called Khadija Chandler and her colleagues at UCLan at Metropolitan University, where they looked at how kind of tropes and stereotypes around race and ethnicity and religion were used to explain domestic homicide. So this person couldn't access services because they were Black British, and this and they had this culture, right? So it kind of, in a weird way, makes them hyper visible, and the language they use is culturalization, but not really, right? Because it's this kind of trope, this stereotype that allows for a really simplistic explanation. The same with things like faith. Although what you often see is that what becomes visible in that context is that which is taken to be other, right? So if someone's white British and nominally Christian, but perhaps not practicing, say, that's probably not going to be discussed in the review.
Right.
Like nobody's going to talk about the fact they're white British and nominally Christian. It's just not. It's not going to come up.
Right.
So it's this kind of this visibility which is really problematic. And of course, other stuff is just not seen or engaged with at all. So so sometimes in some cases I've seen into the death of gay men, there's just not been an understanding of someone's experience of homophobic abuse, for example, and why that might affect how they engage with agencies, or someone's history of contact with the police, and why that history, because of their who they are and their experience of discrimination, for example, might mean they really don't trust the police. And that's something we would need to understand to really be able to tell their story.
Right. Wow. Okay, that's powerful. Thank you for that brilliant explanation. And wait, I'm sorry if you answered this, but who writes the review?
So what you normally have is a local area commissions it.
Okay.
So here in Durham, that would be Durham City Council. Right, and they do it after identifying a case that fits the criteria. So normally that would be a intimate partner homicide, family homicide, or perhaps a death by suicide. And they appoint an independent chair. So an independent chair, it's not terribly well defined, but they're meant to be kind of have certain skills and knowledge, and they're meant to be independent, right? So they're not meant to be part of the local partnerships or local working, because they're meant to be able to bring in and scrutinise. So I was an independent chair for reviews in England and Wales for quite a while. And then that chair works with this multi-agency review panel. So those are panel members who are from agencies who maybe had contact. So they've got some knowledge of the case. So they've got something to bring in terms of a chronology, for example, or explanations of what happened. But you might also have agencies there who are there for their expertise. So they might be there because they're domestic abuse expertise, or if someone does come with a particular faith, and faith was really important to them, well, you might want someone with expertise in terms of faith to kind of bring that too. And family and friends may be involved, but in different ways.
Right.
But yeah, ultimately it's this independent chair who's writing this report with the review panel.
Do we know the representation when it comes to independent review?
It's. I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to that question, but it's.
I don't know.
It's
I
how
don't know.
you.
I'm just imagining.
It's how you might. It's how you guess it could go. So.
Okay.
So in my research for my PhD, I looked at about 60 DHRs, so these published reports, and about just over half of the. And part of the problem was there's relatively little information about who chairs the reports, right? It's just a kind of name and a brief account. But if you look at that, most of them were, at least over half were police officers or ex-police officers. And then if you kind of extrapolated a bit from the information you get there, invariably they were kind of men, presumably kind of middle-aged, because they normally had a kind of completed first career. And there wasn't really any data on other characteristics like ethnicity, but I can guarantee there would almost certainly be kind of white, probably mostly straight, etc. So it's one of the real challenges for review that what would be the word? The conveyor belt to becoming an independent chair kind of replicates what we know about institutions already. So, you know, if an institution is largely made up of certain people, that's kind of who becomes an independent chair, because you do need quite a lot of skill and knowledge to be even in the running. So that's one of the real challenges, I think, for the review system. How do you have a wider range of people chairing these reviews?
It makes sense. So like, when I talk to people, like a lot of I mentioned this last episode about how our disciplines can be can be related in a sense, like when it comes to like representation, and there's certain people who are creating certain types of identities who are, I won't say recreating the traditional script, or recreating these normative narratives that kind of create these types of prejudices and biases, and ultimately because they are growing up in that system as well. But it's about a lot of it's around how do we help transform that, right? And that's a lot of the work that you do. Yeah. And now, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Could you share a particular moment though that you consider a turning point in your life and the research that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the things which led me into this research. So, you know, I trained as a social worker. I started working in domestic abuse, and then, you know, I'd had a career for about 15 years before I came back to do my PhD. But along that journey, I started becoming involved in domestic homicide reviews. And initially I was commissioning them, right? So I was a lead officer for the local council. I was the person going, okay, so a decision's been made, we're going to review this case. We need to get a chair, we need to get a review panel together. And so I can remember the first review I was involved with. This is not as a chair. I was the local, like I said, the local domestic abuse kind of lead. And I've got this distinct memory of going to meet the chair, and we were meeting outside the library because we'd kind of using a room in the library for the meeting. And you know, it's first thing in the morning, and then I suddenly realised we were sitting down to just talk about someone's life and death and try and kind of learn. And we had these agencies kind of trooping in. And it was just this kind of incongruity of that. Like, how is this even possible? How is it we can even just sit here, all of us, and somehow make sense of this person's life and then what happened to them, and somehow do that in a way that is useful, right? And that led me to start thinking about domestic homicide reviews or domestic abuse-related death reviews in terms of them being a system, right? They're a system that, in this case, the government's established and gone, you know what? We're concerned enough about these killings, these deaths by suicide, that we're going to do something about them. We're going to investigate them, basically. Not investigate in terms of policing terms, but, you know, investigate in terms of learning. So they built this system. Then there's this whole process that you have to do, that you have to go and get information from people and have these meetings, or all this stuff, which means we can lose someone sight of someone, right? Because it gets quite procedural. And then we've got this product that we somehow have to write and just put out in the world. So that first experience of a review, it was really kind of changed my direction, because it meant I started getting interested in why are we doing these and how do we do them. And then that led me to chair them, and then it led me to do my PhD, and then ultimately to this job. But the core of that, was this one question, which was like, in that scenario, the victim was dead; she couldn't speak, and her husband was making certain claims about what had happened. And it was just this incongruity that she had no voice. And the only voice we had about her life and death was her husband's. And yet we were all sitting there trying to work it out. So I guess that was a really powerful moment as a kind of something I was doing as my job. To kind of go, hang on, but how? How do we do this? How do we do this in a way that is actually meaningful? You know, because it feels like it might not be, or there might be challenges or barriers to that.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Now we've talked a bit about, you mentioned some stuff about flipping, how you flip the traditional script, but what is, I know, like I said, you sent me some research to look up, and I found it quite fascinating around, like, some of the work that we do is very similar in a way when it comes to like understanding representation, identity. How do we prevent things, right? Prevention is better than curing, right? Or what's the term? What is it again?
Yeah, prevention better than cure.
Yeah, prevention over curing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you take like you try to take a holistic framing around that, right? So what specifically, how is your research or your activism flipping the script?
So what I'm hoping I can do is get us to really think about how we do these reviews, right? That's what I really want to do. So one of the challenges, I think, is if you said to someone, people get killed in intimate and family relationships, normally women, usually by men. Should we do something about that? Most people are going to say yes. And then if you say to someone, one of the things we could do about that is get everyone together and just work out what happened and try and learn from that. Most people will go, sounds kind of sensible, right? So when you talk about review, it seems really commonsensical that of course we should do this. Of course we should try and understand what happened and generate learning. And I guess, if you reduced all my work down to one thing, I'm the person who, with some other colleagues, who keeps popping up and flipping the script by going, maybe it's not that simple. Right. And maybe I'm just doing what all academics do, which is make things more complicated. But, what I'm kind of saying is, well, hang on, there's much more involved in this. Like, how do we keep someone central? What do we imagine the purpose of this is? So, you think about these reviews, are they to learn lessons for what agencies might want to do in future, or are they to tell someone's story and memorialize them? Or are they to fulfill a need for their family? So a lot of, I guess, what I'm trying to do is flip it by saying, hang on, this is more complicated. And one of the things we have to think about is power in these systems, because these systems have a lot of power in them, and we're potentially taking power away from people. And certainly in terms of the victim, they're not here. How do we continue to kind of allow them a kind of in my thesis, I borrowed someone else's language and called it like an attenuated agency. How can we still keep them present with us in a way that means we do these reviews in a way that's respectful and meaningful about what we could learn from their life and their experiences.
Right. Yeah. So it's like I don't know what the term would be like, but it's just like you're trying to, there's power in that, right? There's power in the work that you're doing, but then there's also power in terms of trying to understand the victim story. And
the power of stories, right? And what happened to someone. But of course, it's quite hard to sit around, if you're an agency, it's quite hard to get in that space. It's you have to be quite vulnerable. So it's why this work is hard. You need people to be able to go in there and go, you know what? Maybe we didn't get it right. In fact, maybe we actively made it worse. So what can we learn from that? How can we do differently? How can we do better? And the whole point of these reviews is they're underpinned by this philosophy of accountability, not blame. But power is really difficult, right? It's quite diffuse. It affects everything we do. So it can make it really hard for people to not be defensive or to feel they can speak. So we're constantly having to try and work within that context and in a way destabilize that a bit, because we need people to give up power and to be open, right? And to have that dialogue, but also then recognize how power is shaping victim and perpetrators' experiences of services, of life, the kind of options they had, and if we can't see that, including kind of systemic issues, well, we can't really learn properly about what might have made a difference or could make a difference to someone else.
All right, that's a good point. Okay, thank you. Because you mentioned about like academics and how this idea of questioning. I know what I've learned, because like I said, I didn't grow up in an academic background, but what I have learned, the respect I have for researchers, specifically around this idea of you have to question. To do a PhD, you have to question. You have to support everything that you do, right? So I guess it depends on how you approach that when it comes to different types of scenarios or whatever it is in the work that you're doing. So I think it is powerful and it's important to question those procedures, but it's how we do it, right? And I think I know how y'all are doing it is very empowering, and I'd say very important. And with that being said, this reminds me, I took a quote from your paper. I forgot, is the I don't know if it's intersectionality and invisibility paper.
Okay, which I did with some colleagues.
Yes, okay. I want to ask you a question around this quote and how you feel about it now.
The one I haven't seen, so this is putting me on the spot. Don't ask me what page it comes from.
Okay, but so basically, I was gonna ask about your work. Where do you see yourself leaving a lasting legacy? But first, I wanted to talk about this quote. So you said, "Domestic violence and abuse casts a long and devastating toll. Despite welcome progress, it still seems sometimes to be understood as something that is too big to end or will be always with us. I don't believe that is true." How do you feel about that now? Or should I read it again?
Yeah, no, I remember that, and I think that was one of the quote. That was a quote specifically for me, right? Yes. And for people who won't have seen this paper, this is a paper that I and 3 other colleagues wrote together, and it was very much a dialogue, right? So we were in dialogue about how we think about these kind of issues, and we would, so in the paper there's all these quotes where we kind of talk about these things, and I think that's really true. I think it's like any social problem. Sometimes it feels too big. It's so vast, and that vastness often means we're a bit disconnected from it, right? We may not have directly experienced something ourselves, or even if we have, or people around us have, it just feels like we can't resolve it, and we just might be trying to survive it, right? Or kind of ride alongside it. And I think that's true. I think we constantly have that, and you see that in review systems. So people become quite unambitious, perhaps, about what they want to learn or find, because it doesn't feel like they could solve it anyway, right? So you end up with really kind of generic, or maybe we should get a bit more training for people. But that's that kind of power I was talking about, that kind of long shadow that casts itself. But I think we have to believe we can end violence and abuse, right? And we can. We know what makes the difference there in terms of attitudes, in terms of how we get support people to seek help sooner, how we ultimately try and prevent it in the first place, right? And some of that starts with education. It links to our gendered world, right? It's intersects with other identities as well, and other forms of power which make people more or less vulnerable. And I don't think anyone would be doing this work if they didn't believe they could contribute to the ending of violence and abuse. And it may be not in their own lifetime, but that doesn't mean that possibility that we're building, and that's where we remember who came before, right? So like activism around violence and abuse and its history, and where we might want to kind of continue that. I think that's so important. And it's something I talk about in my work, that there's this irony in review that it's really hopeful, right? You're dealing with tragedy, you're dealing with these awful circumstances, and you might also be dealing with really challenging learning because agencies didn't do something or whatever. It's really hard. But actually the whole process is underpinned by hope. That hope that something not necessarily not good, but something meaningful could come out of tragedy, that you can maybe improve things for someone, the next person. And that's also what often motivates family, right? If you family can take part in these reviews, and if you talk to them, often obviously really mixed views on what they're for and how they work, but often what family is saying is like, I want my loved one to be seen, and I want something to change. I want this not to then affect other people, right? I want to see something shift. And I think that's really hopeful as well, right? There's something quite powerful about that possibility that we can do something different. We can make it better for the next person. And but it can feel hard to keep that in sight, right? When we're faced with it's an epidemic of violence, and particularly gender-based violence that we see every day. And in the current political context, it often feels like some people, clearly get away with some awful things.
I know. I'm glad you mentioned hope, because I was going to mention that word too. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's like, I know Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks talks about this pedagogy of hope as well, and I like the term when you talked about possibilities. What's possible, and how do we move forward? What does the future look like, right? And how can we reimagine a world where we feel like the hope that we have that will make a difference in that time span in the future. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So just around
absolutely.
that.
And some of that's about recognizing you can't do everything, right?
Yes, that's
and
true.
You've got to care for yourself in that too, but you can everything we do has meaning. One of the theorist I really heavily used in my PhD was Sarah Ahmed, and her book on use.
Yes.
And she writes beautifully about paths and the well-trodden path, right? So it's used because it's always been used before, and certain people maybe have the right of use or control who can use that path. But then Ahmed goes to talk about kind of ideas of queer use. So actually maybe you don't have to take that path. Maybe you could take a different path.
Yes.
And that might be quite a lot harder because it's not been trodden before, right? So you may have to kind of go quite far back to be able to see that maybe you could get over the hill that other way. But that's that idea of possibility, that we don't have to stay in that one route. And I think that's that I often find quite powerful, that when it feels quite hopeless, it's often because you can't see it above the horizon, right? So how do you step back and either care for yourself or have some solidarity in terms of what you're experiencing, or others that you can call on? That's why this is often quite a collective endeavor as well, I think.
Right. Okay. Because I saw that the use you mentioned was good too around Sarah Ahmed. Yeah. So it's like, I'm thinking of like codes or something. I like to use codes and thematics like impossible possibilities or something like that.
Sounds good to me. It's getting a bit quantum physics.
But okay, thank you for sharing that. But where I guess we talked about that. But where do you see your work leaving a lasting legacy and positively impacting?
Well, like on a really practical limit, I really hope that I can inform how we do these reviews and do them well. I'd like this system to work, and I think it has some impact. It has successes, but there's lots of questions. So, I want it to work well, and that means that we do something meaningful with these tragedies in a way that is not itself compounding harm, right? Yeah. So if I can make if my work can be used to improve how we do these reviews, to make sure we learn more and more effectively and bring about change, well, that's great, and that's kind of ultimately what I want to see it being used for.
Okay, oh, thank you. That's powerful. All right, now we're at a good time. Now we're at the end.
Okay,
concluding part of the show. Now we're going to talk a bit about. You're going to offer us insight around rehumanization, or humanization, however you want to frame it. So if you could reflect on your journey thus far, what do you know now that you wish you knew before?
That's a good question. I think the thing I have really learned is the importance of actually really thinking about and knowing your kind of your own emotional world, actually, is what I'd say.
Okay.
So, I had a very nice childhood and have a great family, but we're very British in some ways. We don't like talk about feelings particularly. And
similar to our household.
You see it everywhere, right? Like, and so what that meant was often how I kind of approached the world as well. You just don't talk about the stuff, you kind of power through and on you go. And one of the things I've really learned as I became involved in these reviews, both as someone like commissioning them, then chairing them, then researching them, is you need to be able to like look at yourself as you do that. Because if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to see the emotion in others, right? So you're not going to be able to center a victim, because it's almost an imaginative leap too far to then go, how do I sit with this person or sit alongside them? You're not going to see the emotion of other people in a review panel. You're not going to try and empathize and understand where they're coming from. So I think there's something really valuable in recognizing your own emotional world and the labor that you might have to put into things as the kind of necessary part of then being able to see that in others and then hopefully kind of build with others, right? Because that's when you can share or support or encourage or hear from. So I think that kind of rehumanization often starts with ourselves and our ability to kind of feed that back and then receive it in return.
Oh, right. I loved how you said, because it's like part of it is like loving thyself and just knowing thyself, but emotional world, that's a really powerful statement. I love that. And you kind of just answered it, but I'll still ask you anyway. Now, this was a great episode. Thank you for joining. We spoke a lot about, your background, some about femicide, domestic abuse, how the traditional script is kind of around who is about where power is initiated, right? Who's delegating the power? How do we differentiate what is acceptable when it comes to telling somebody else's story? Yeah. Right. And it's about questioning those normative practices that do kind of create this invisible victims. Yeah. Right. Or survivors. Right. And we also talked about, this impossible possibilities, and how we need hope in the work that we do. Right. And that's very powerful in terms of just trying to navigate the world in terms of being able to make a difference. With all that being said, what does rehumanization look like to you?
What does it look like to me? Gosh, I think it's that. So, I'll give you an example from my own work, right? So one of the things I talk about in terms of review, and something I learned to do as a chair, and something that I write about then in my thesis and then my book, is this imaginative act. Actually, that was borrowing from Les Back's work on this imaginative act of imagining someone sitting next to you. So in terms of, and that in this case the victim, right? So actually that really you really have to be, for that to do something, you have to really mean it, right? So, and ultimately in terms of review, you almost end up asking that question to this imagined person who you've brought alongside you to say, is this is your review, right? This is have I told your story right? Okay, and they can't answer you back, of course, but I think there's something about that that act of imagining someone alongside you and recognizing that they can still kind of influence our actions, right? The dead are still with us, right, in terms of their kind of memory and their influence, and I think that's that in terms of my work, that's what that rehumanization would be. So I think you could not produce, or it's a lot harder to produce a report which doesn't really tell someone's story, which doesn't really try and contextualize their lived experience. If everyone involved was doing that, really trying to imagine that person kind of with them. And there are practices in review that people use to help with that. So using photos, for example. So actually you don't go into this just with some files, you go into this with a picture that you know what that person looked like, because it helps us root that work in humanity, right? That recognizing this is a person who has died. Otherwise it just becomes a process where we don't humanize,
right?
You know, and I guess that links to that other bit I said. It's about that emotion in self, emotion in other, and that takes work, and people need the space and time and support to do that.
Okay, so just to try to put it all together, so it's about understanding your own emotional world, but then at the same time reimagining the person's story you're trying to tell, and recognizing that story in terms of I don't know, trying your best to put it out there in the most authentic way possible.
Yeah, exactly. And that will always be impartial. That will always be partial, right? It'll always be incomplete, and it will be fleeting. But the effort is what's important, right? It'll never be, you'll never fully achieve that. Right. But you're recognizing this contradiction of the work you're doing, that we are, a victim is silenced by death. We can also silence them, but if we don't do it well, but what we can try and do is do it as well as we can, and keep those things in tension. That's really important.
Okay, thank you. Wow,
pleasure.
Amazing talk. All right, that's it. So, but do you have any like social media handles that people could follow you on? Any social media handles?
Well, like I said, I think when we were talking before, I'm a bit of a Luddite. But I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, but both JH Rowlands, Rowlands with a W and an S.
W and S, so James Rowlands. All right, so, but thank you for today. It was an amazing episode. Vibers, you're going to enjoy this one. I really appreciate you coming and taking the time out to talk to me and just sharing your story. It's very powerful. Continue to do the work that you're doing. It's amazing. I'd say obviously we're gonna stay in touch. We're gonna be around each other. But are you still taking German at all or no?
I need to work out what I'm signing up for. So yeah, maybe we'll be in a German class.
Are you gonna take the A1 certificate?
I would really like to. I need to get on. I just need to get it. Get my German.
I need to get back on it because I've slipped since the course ended. Okay. I need to get on.
We need to get on our verbs
and tennis as well. All right. Well, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for time.
All right. Fantastic episode. Thank you again, James, for coming and vibing with me and allowing our vibers to have an idea of your story, understand your background, why you do the work that you do. One of the main things that came out of that for me is it goes back to that whole, so much of the work that we do in this type of community kind of it's cross-sectional, like it's interrelated. The things that we do as far as when it comes to social justice and when it comes to understanding the self and knowledge of the self impacts of the work you do. So it was really important about what he talked about, this understanding our emotional world and understanding how once we understand the journeys that we've been on, our biases and how we overcome them, that in turn impacts how we do our work, how we treat others. And it's important to know thyself, right? And that's what we preach a lot here, but flipping and vibing about loving thyself, and that facilitates and assists you into loving others. And I felt like the discussion today was very powerful, and it taught me a lot around domestic abuse related reviews specifically. And hopefully one day we can get to a world where everyone or majority of us are championing that, understanding our own insecurities and understanding how the way we move impacts others, and our biases influence policies, and policies then impact how we interpersonal experiences. So I think today was an important episode to just understand that the different ways of working in different types of disciplines, but how so much of what we do when it comes to reaching authenticity, right, is about understanding the self and being able to question things that are considered normative in today's society, right? It's about flipping the script as well. Once we question traditional scripts, right, that need to be flipped. So, yeah, today was powerful. Thank you, James, again. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Yeah, until the next episode, one love.